There are women who raise other people's children with the same love as if they had given birth to them, and for whom the town never finds the right name, because the town only names what it understands, and only understands what it can see. Remedios Salazar had learned this through years and through silence, because she had spent 7 years building a home inside a farm that wasn't hers, and raising 3 children who weren't hers either, with the same hands that had ground Graciela's corn before Graciela died. And because that October morning, someone from the past had arrived on horseback at Las Nimas, Durango. If you believe that quiet people who work without asking for recognition are the bravest of all, subscribe to Tales of the Old Country and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single tale. What the town of Las Nimas called staying to live in the widower's house had a long history that few had bothered to learn before forming an opinion. Remedios Salazar had arrived at Finca El Sabino 7 years earlier, 2 weeks after Graciela Bravo died of fever, leaving Don Lucio with 3 small children and a kitchen without fire. She had been brought by Graciela's aunt, who was also Remedios's godmother, because someone had to come, and because at that moment Remedios had nowhere else to go. What Remedios carried then was a story the town already knew and used every time it needed to reduce her to something manageable. 7 years earlier, Aurelio Mendoza had left her standing 8 days before the wedding with a letter that arrived by the errand boy, and that said, in few words and without apology, that his family had considered the matter and believed Remedios was not the right person to carry the Mendoza name. 3 lines. No further explanation. The town took the news as its own. Doa Encarna Villafuerte was the first to give it a name. She called her the one the Mendoza family left standing, which was a way of saying the mistake had been Remedios's and not the man's who left, and that name stuck in the town's memory like whitewash on an old wall. The worst moment was not the letter nor the weeks that followed. It was 3 months later, a Tuesday morning with the sun already high over the plaza, when the market of Las Nimas was full of people and voices. Doa Encarna was with 4 women buying goat cheese beside Sor Angela's stall when she saw Remedios arrive with her wicker basket. She pointed at her without lowering her voice 1 degree, with the whole plaza as witness. That's the one who stayed to live in the widower's house, without papers or surname or any trade, but making herself necessary wherever they let her in. Sor Angela looked at the cheese she had in her hand. The 4 women fell silent. Remedios heard every word with her feet planted on the dirt floor of the market. She took the cheese she had asked for, paid for it without hurrying, settled the basket on her arm, and walked away slowly, without turning her face, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her change expression. But that silence Remedios carried back to Finca El Sabino weighed differently from the other silences she had carried in her life, because it was the silence of things one cannot put on the table and explain, because the one who needs to explain has already lost something that words don't recover. Don Lucio never knew of that Tuesday. Remedios didn't tell him. She had arrived at the farm with a blue rebozo inherited from her mother and a cardboard box with a little clothing, and during the first weeks she said almost nothing more than what was necessary to understand the house. Don Lucio was a man of few words who spent his days in the field, returned at sundown, and ate whatever was put on the table without complaint, looking at his children with love and with the not quite knowing what to do with them now that they were alone. Toms was 8 years old and already wanted to seem a man. Lucida was 5 and cried for her mother some nights with her face in the pillow. Little Beto was 2 and asked for her at any hour, without system, without expecting an answer. Remedios learned the farm slowly, room by room. In Graciela's room she had found, in the drawer of the little table, a notebook with worn leather covers, the recipes written in a round, tight hand. The hand of someone who writes so that someone else will read it later. guava atole, tamales de rajas, Sunday beef broth. Each recipe had notes in the margin, sometimes a quantity, sometimes a piece of advice that only someone who has cooked much with love can give. Remedios opened it the first time with the feeling of reading a letter not addressed to her. Then, she opened it a second time, and a third, and in the end she took it to the kitchen and put it beside the metate, because it was the only way she found to know the woman who had lived in that house before her. Over the months, she went on filling the blank spaces of the notebook with her own handwriting, more slanted than Graciella's and tighter. First just a note in the margin, and then another, and then the whole notebook became of the two of them, without anyone asking them to do it that way. Of Graciella and of Remedios sharing the same worn leather notebook as if they had agreed to do so. What Remedios didn't yet know was that Graciella had thought of her before she died, even though they had never met. Sometimes God puts the exact people on the exact road without either of them knowing it yet. Don Lucio noticed her the way one notices people who do their work well without asking to be noticed, late and all at once, as if she had been there the whole time, and one only now saw what was in front of him. One afternoon, when he came back from the field earlier than usual, he found Remedios teaching Lucita to make tortillas with patience, hand over the warm dough, and he stood in the doorway of the corridor without entering and without announcing himself. He said nothing. He went on to his room, but Lucita told Remedios that night that he had watched a good while before leaving, and that he had a face she hadn't seen on him before. Graciella's dark wooden rosary had hung by the kitchen window since the second month, since Remedios had put it there the day she understood that on that farm Graciella's memory was not a ghost that pursued her, but a presence that accompanied her. Each morning the light of the Sierra touched it before touching anything else in the kitchen. That night, for the first time since she arrived at the farm, Remedios slept without dreaming of the Mendoza letter. The years passed the way they pass on the farms of Durango, slowly during the days, fast when one looks back and wonders where so much time went. Toms grew and learned the field beside his father, and began to bring the cattle to the corral on his own each afternoon, with the same serious manner Don Lucio had of doing things. Lucita developed the habit of sitting beside Remedios on Sundays to copy recipes into a new notebook Remedios had bought her in Las Nimas, and to write with the slanted hand Remedios had taught her without telling her she was teaching it. Little Beto called Remedios Remy from the time he was 3, and no one on the farm had ever corrected him. And Remedios had never said whether it bothered her or gladdened her, though Don Lucio had once seen her smile with her back turned when Beto said it aloud in front of the townspeople. Each morning began the same from the first year to the 7th. Before the rooster crowed, Remedios lit the fire in the adobe stove, put the clay pot coffee on to boil, and took out the recipe notebook. Then she made the tortillas on the griddle. Then she knocked on each child's door with her knuckles twice. By the third knock, Beto was already up. Lucita needed 4. Tom's opened only when he smelled the coffee. Don Lucio drank his coffee standing by the gate, looking toward the hill of Durango, and Remedios left the jug at the edge of the table without saying anything, and he took it without saying anything. And that silence of the mornings was the only moment of the day when the two of them shared the same place, without needing to speak, and that the silence was comfortable Remedios had noticed long after it already was. 3 times in 7 years the town had tried to convince Don Lucio to clarify what Remedios was in that house. Don Lucio answered the first 2 with silence. The third he told the messenger that the affairs of his farm were his own. The messenger recounted it his own way, and Doa Encarna interpreted it as confirmation of her suspicions, and repeated it in the store of Señora Angela's daughter, who had inherited the business and the gossip in the same measure. Remedios knew all this, she said nothing to Don Lucio. She followed the pages of Graciella's notebook and her own notes in the margin, the routine of 7 years as the only argument that made sense to make when the world still doesn't know how to listen to the other kind. The blue rebozo inherited from her mother hung in her room over the wooden chair, and Remedios looked at it some nights before falling asleep and remembered her mother telling her, many years before, "The one who scorns you does it because he can't reach you, mija, not because you're beneath him." She hadn't fully believed it then. But 7 years at Finca El Sabino had given her reasons to begin believing it. A day before Aurelio arrived, Lucida asked Remedios while she copied a recipe whether she had ever wanted to leave the farm to look for another life. Remedios folded the corner of the notebook and thought the answer through, with the same care she measured the ingredients of the broth. She said at last, "This house needed me when I arrived. And what needs you, if you tend it well, becomes part of you without your deciding it." Lucida wrote that in the margin of her notebook instead of the recipe she was copying. Remedios saw it and said nothing. But Aurelio Mendoza hadn't come to Las Nimas only to talk about land. He arrived a Wednesday at noon when the October sun beat hard over the dirt road of Durango, and the dust of the horse could be made out from the corridor of the farm before the figure itself took shape against the hill. Don Lucio went out to the gate to receive him, because they had agreed by letter to review the boundaries of the south plot, which had been in dispute for years with the neighbor on the adjoining land, and needed a trusted notary to put things on paper before the matter got more complicated. Remedios recognized him before he got down from the horse. Aurelio Mendoza was 50 years well carried and wore the city clothes worn by people who left the countryside and don't want it forgotten that they no longer belong to it. And he carried a dark brown leather portfolio hung from the saddle with the care of someone carrying things that weigh more for what they contain than for what they are. He got down slowly, greeted Don Lucio by the hand, and then raised his eyes toward the corridor and found her standing beside the kitchen door with the recipe notebook in her hand and the apron tied at her waist and the wooden rosary visible from where he stood. They looked at each other a moment that lasted longer than such things last. Remedios went into the kitchen. That afternoon, while Don Lucio and Aurelio reviewed the maps of the south plot on the corridor table, Remedios served the coffee without looking at him, and he followed her with his eyes in the manner of someone processing a surprise he hadn't expected to find at the end of such a familiar road. When Don Lucio went out a moment to the field to show the farmhand where the south boundary was marked, Aurelio spoke. Remedios, she didn't answer right away. She kept setting the jugs on the table. Aurelio lowered his voice before going on. "I learned you were here a few months ago, by letter. I came earlier than planned because I bring something that has to be for you and that has waited too long to arrive." He opened the leather portfolio. He took out an envelope of thick paper, sealed with red wax that time had turned dark. He set it on the table with care. "Graciela Bravo signed this before my office 4 months before she died," he said. "She asked that it be given to the woman who would care for her children with presence and with heart when she could no longer do it." In the document she described the dark wooden rosary with the small brass cross that this woman would carry with her. She said whoever knew how to look would recognize it. Remedios looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Graciela's rosary hanging by the window, the one she herself had put there the 2nd month of her arrival, because it was where there was the most light. For a moment, she had no words left. What she was about to understand, none of the people who had talked about her in Las Nimas for 7 years had imagined it, that Graciela had chosen her before knowing her, that the recipe notebook with the margin notes of 2 different hands was part of a testament that had spent years waiting for her hands. The envelope contained a letter from Graciela, written in her own hand, dated in the last months of her life, and a notarized deed that granted rights over Finca El Sabino in the name of Don Lucio in life, and at his will or death in the name of the woman the document described with exactness, the rosary, the presents, the children cared for. All with seals, signatures, and 2 witnesses by full name that the city notary had registered in his book. When Don Lucio came back from the field and read the document in silence, he stood in the corridor with the paper in his hand and his eyes fixed on a point on the floor that was no particular point, and that was all of them at once. Then he looked at Remedios. Then he looked at Aurelio. Then he said, slowly and with the voice of someone who doesn't use many words but chooses well the ones he uses, Graciela always knew more than I did. The next day, Don Lucio went to town with Aurelio and with the document. The judge of Las Nimas reviewed the seals and the notary's signature with his glasses set firmly on, and said with all the calm of one who has reviewed many papers in his life, "Everything is in order, Don Lucio. This is valid from the moment it was signed." Aurelio Mendoza heard him say that without moving from his chair. And then he looked at Don Lucio and said something he hadn't planned to say when he set out that morning. Remedios Salazar never needed anyone's name to be worth what she's worth. She only needed time for the world to catch up to what she already was. Don Lucio looked at him a moment without answering, but when he reached the farm that afternoon, he sought out Remedios in the kitchen and told her without preamble, the paper was registered before the judge. "It's yours, Remedios, as it always should have been." Doa and Carna arrived 3 days later, a Friday at 10 in the morning, accompanied by 2 women from town and the foreman of the Villafuerte family. They stopped at the gate of Finca El Sabino, with the posture of those who come to demand an accounting, but haven't fully decided how to demand it without looking bad. Don Lucio received them in the corridor. Doa and Carna said the town had questions about the documents, that people were saying a woman without land or surname couldn't receive rights over a farm built with the work of the Bravo family, that she, as a longtime neighbor, had the duty to clear things up before the rumors kept running. Don Lucio wiped his hands on his pants, which was his gesture for when he was thinking something through carefully before saying it. Then he said with his usual calm, "The papers are registered before the judge of Las Nimas. If you have questions about the documents, you have to ask him, because that's what he's there for." Doa and Carna said it wasn't a matter of judges but of decency, that the community had values to defend, that it was one thing to give someone work and quite another to give rights over a property to a woman who had arrived without anyone calling her and stayed without anyone fully explaining why. Toms, who was 15 years old and had been standing by the corral gate since he'd seen the visitors arrive, spoke with the voice of someone who has already decided what he's going to say and doesn't need to rehearse it. "My mother called Remy before she died. There's a paper that says so. And she raised us for 7 years. He paused briefly. That's not up for discussion either. There are loyalties that aren't bought with surname or with blood. They're bought with presence, with patience, with hands that don't let go. The 2 women accompanying Doa and Carna looked at each other with the face of someone hearing something they didn't expect from a boy of 15. Aurelio Mendoza had arrived before the visit that morning because something had told him it was wise to be present. He was standing beside the kitchen door when Doa and Carna finished speaking. He took a step and spoke with a calm voice. "I signed those papers before the law and before God, and I owe Remedios Salazar a debt that has nothing to do with papers, that of having wronged her many years ago in front of many people of this same town. So if anyone has something to say about who deserves to be on this farm, let them say it with their own name." No one said it. The foreman looked at his boots. Doa and Carna looked at the corridor the recipe notebook open on the table, Graciella's rosary hanging by the window. She calculated something in silence. Then she told her companions they had to leave. They went out through the gate without anyone seeing them off. Remedios had heard everything from the kitchen without looking out to the corridor. When the dust of Doa and Carna's horses faded down the dirt road, Lucita came into the kitchen and sat beside her in silence and took her hand on the table. Remedios let her. Outside, Beto ran through the patio chasing the chickens with a palm broom, neither knowing nor caring what had happened in the corridor that morning. Don Lucio came into the kitchen, poured himself a jug of the coffee that was already lukewarm, and sat down on the other side of the table, without saying anything and without leaving either. Sometimes inside someone who seems defeated there is a strength the town cannot calculate, because that strength comes not from the surname nor from the deeded land, but from the years one accumulates doing what one has to do when no one is watching or applauding, and from the patience of knowing that life has its own way of putting each thing in its place, even if it sometimes takes longer than one would wish, and arrives by the road one least expected. Months later, when spring came to Finca El Sabino and the apple trees of the orchard blossomed for the first time in 2 years, the long table of the corridor was full of people and voices. Toms had brought his girlfriend, who was the daughter of a ranch in the Durango Sierra, and who had arrived with a basket of country fruit, and who already helped Remedios wash the dishes with the naturalness of someone who enters a kitchen because she feels she can, and because no one is watching to see if she makes a mistake. Lucita had turned 19 that month and had copied the entire recipe notebook of Graciela and Remedios into her own new notebook, and had added at the end 5 recipes of her own, with her own margin notes, in the same slanted hand Remedios had taught her, without telling her she was teaching it. Little Beto, who was no longer so little, and who came up to Don Lucio's shoulder, had built with his father a new wooden bench for the corridor, because the old one had splintered, and had told Don Lucio while they nailed it that Remy deserved to sit on something that didn't creak when one moved. The recipe notebook of Graciela and Remedios lay on the table with the cover open to the page of the Sunday tamales de rajas, which they had set to making since before dawn, with the year's corn and cheese from the little goat in the corral. Graciela's wooden rosary hung by the window, where it had always hung since the 2nd month. Her mother's blue rebozo was over Remedios's shoulders because the morning had come cool from the Sierra, the way mornings come in Durango when the season is changing. Don Lucio served the coffee standing, as he always had. But this time he served it for everyone, beginning with Remedios. At the end of the afternoon, when the children had gone off to the field to do the last chores of the day and the corridor fell silent, Don Lucio sat beside Remedios and told her, without preamble and without prior rehearsal, with the direct voice of men who don't speak much, but who, when they speak, say what is. Graciela chose well when she thought of you for this house, and I took too long to say it aloud. Remedios looked at the notebook on the table, Graciela's hand and her own mixed on the same worn leather pages. She answered slowly, with the voice of someone who has kept the answer stored a long time and finally finds the right moment to say it. You said it now. In time. Don Lucio nodded once and said no more. Sometimes inside someone who seems defeated there is a strength the town cannot calculate, because that strength comes not from the surname, nor from the deeded land, but from the years one accumulates doing what one has to do when no one is watching, and from the patience of knowing that life has its own way of putting each thing in its place, even if it sometimes takes longer than one would wish. Have you ever had someone believe in you right when you were beginning to doubt your own worth? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below and tell us from where you're watching us today. Subscribe to the channel Tales of the Old Country and turn on the bell so no tale escapes you. And if you know someone who has given much without receiving the recognition they deserve, share this story with that person today. Until the next story. A heartfelt embrace, from heart to heart. In Las Nimas, they greeted Remedios Salazar differently, with that quiet respect that isn't asked for or bought and that takes years to earn, but that when it comes to stay.